Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the recording is starting now.
Okay, well, it is 4 o'clock, so we'll just get a start. So the sooner we start, the sooner you can we can finish and you can start your afternoon. So welcome to our week 4, term 3 statewide staff meeting on HSC monitoring. My name is Marcela Ayas, and I'm a language officer with the Languages and Culture team with the Department of Education. This term, sorry, yes, we're starting, yes. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, Marcella, we can hear you.
Yeah. Oh,
Yes.
sorry. Okay, sorry. So as I was saying, this is for this term, the statewide staff meeting have an HSC focus with today's session on HSC monitoring, and week 7 session we look at setting assessments with a guest host Adele Burke from MESA.
Sorry, I am moving it.
Yeah, it's lagging, I think. Yeah. Please note that we are recording this session, so we can share it with anyone who couldn't join us today. We'll also be sharing a copy of the slide deck in our statewide staff room, so if you're a member there's no need to take any notes. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands we're meeting on today and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I would like to acknowledge that I am on the lands of the Darug people in the hills, and I would also like to extend my respect to any Aboriginal people who are joining us today. So welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest host for today's session, Kate Thompson. Kate is the State 6 advisor with the secondary curriculum team. Welcome, Kate.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here today. So thanks for having me. I am connecting from Guringai land, and I pay respect to the elders past and present. I'm just wondering if we should turn off our microphones and webcams just to kind of streamline the feed, I guess, because is that normal practice?
Yes,
it just might help in terms of your
bandwidth. Mute and turn videos off. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, it might help people's feeds depending on where you are. But yes, my name's Kate Thompson, and I'm currently the Stage 6 advisor with the Department of Education, and I've got an HSIE background, but there's one person in the room. It's Yung Ray from Chatswood High School, who I've worked with when I was head of teaching and learning there, and managed the ESL, it was at the time, and languages faculty. And Yung Ray was amazing. So I do understand the perspective somewhat of a language teacher, but I don't know the ins and outs of it, obviously. I've got a different background, but I understand that you might be the only language teacher in your school, or you might be, in a central school, in a senior secondary college, you might be the head teacher of languages or supervised by a non-language head teacher, or anything in between, basically. So we've got about an hour to unpack the HSC monitoring kind of requirements, and I'm hoping that it kind of meets the needs today, but I'll be around for any questions, and obviously you can contact me after today if you've got any questions and that kind of thing. So yes, there is a strong focus on HSC monitoring. It's really important to know about, particularly in this learning from home period, in terms of making sure that we're all still following good, fair processes. The 2022 processes will be similar. So starting, next term, obviously, but I can just show you excerpts of the 2021 documentation. And the reason for that is the 2022 documentation doesn't come out until almost the HSC exams are finished. Otherwise, there's a bit of overlap and kind of potential for, confusion, and we don't want that. So am clicking. I think there is a bit of a lag actually. So what's the context for this HSC monitoring? It actually brings together, it's a document that brings together a whole range of information that is, it kind of is underpinned, it underpins what we do, I guess. We need to abide by what's in the Education Act. We have to follow what NESA says, as we know. There are a range of rules and regulations put together, and they are articulated in a thing called the ACE manual. And we obviously need to provide various information, log in, meet certain requirements with NESA's schools online. So that's often where exec go to input student, subjects, grades, etc., etc. Now, this might be you in your school. If you don't have a head teacher languages or something like that, you might be required to do some head teacher type things. If you're a classroom teacher, otherwise you will here to learn, and you may or may not know what I'm talking about. I can hear little beeping, but I'm just wondering if that's the chat, because I can't see it because I've got my slide notes up. So please interrupt.
It's Elizabeth. Because we offer these cross-sectorally, it's when a guest is in the lobby and we're just admitting them in the background. So we can't get rid of the noise, but just ignore it.
I just thought, because I've got my slide notes up, I actually can't see the chat, so I'm happy to be interrupted. It doesn't bother me. If you've got a question pertinent to the slide that I'm on, then, please just chime in. In terms of this HSC monitoring, as I said, it brings together a range of various bits of legislation, rules and things like that. The other one, or the next one, is syllabuses, making sure we're all aware of the correct syllabus requirements for stage 6, making sure that we're teaching the correct syllabus. We don't want to be one of those schools that is in Sydney Morning Herald a few moments after the students leave the HSC exam. It also brings together the idea of the stronger HSC standards, which came into play a couple of years ago. And that meant changes to assessment requirements, like streamlining and mandating various components, mandating the weighting of some tasks and the number of tasks. I should say that with a proviso that actually principals this year have the discretion to change some of that because of COVID. But anyway, it was about changes to assessment requirements, limiting, the number of and weighting of tasks, basically. The next one. This is about NESA and the registration of the school government system, and NESA oversees the registration of all schools, including New South Wales public schools. And it came as a result of NESA highlighting, sorry, I've got a little person here. One second. Sorry, we have had words about this. Anyway, now I'm interrupted. NESA is responsible for the registration of all schools, including New South Wales public schools, but it's about ensuring we're teaching the correct syllabus, and might not even be the wrong subject, but it might be an old syllabus, and we want people to set the right number of tasks as well. And finally, we've got the curriculum policy standards, which have just been updated this term actually, and that's about curriculum planning and programming, assessing and reporting to parents, K-12 policy. So that actually needs to be abided by or retained by schools, and tells you what you need to keep. But the HSC monitoring document does specify it. And the update, just out of interest, was in relation to stage 5 electives, and there's information in the new staff notice board about that. So with the view of of providing effective and efficient processes, we've got to prioritise teaching time. So we want to reduce this administrative burden of HSC monitoring and really maximise the teaching time, because that's where the experts, kind of happen. Daddy. Go get Daddy. Sorry, everyone. We've had an issue. We were watching, I put Moana on, but I've just been, the whole train of thought just thrown. So apologies, this is what working from home is like, isn't it? So all of this information can be found on the Stage 6 webpage. And thank you, Elizabeth, for putting this slide in, actually. The link is down the bottom, and as I said, you'll get a copy of the slides after today. So I recommend visiting that. And I do need to draw your attention to the fact that the ROSA monitoring information is on this page as well. Yes, I know it's stage 5, but that's where it is. We'll try and work on that. So just so you're aware, some key differences from previous years to 2021. One of the main ones was about COVID advice, and the NESA COVID advice allowed principals discretion, as I said, over the number, type and weighting of tasks. Given, I don't want to make predictions, but given the outbreak, we may see some kind of advice come out soon, after this year's HSC has finished. I don't know, that's up to them, and we'll abide by whatever rules they kind of set, and it'll be fair to all, regardless of what school setting you're in. So up until the last lockdown in Greater Sydney, for example, yes, principals did have discretion. However, the expectation was, because there weren't too many, issues up until, say June or July, I think it was, the expectation was business as usual. Unless your school was affected by COVID, then you really need to proceed as usual. So there's more information about that in the ACE manual. And that little notification, but NESA has notifications on their site as well. So another key difference is in how information is collected, and we're trying to just make it more efficient. So previously it was done on paper at a local level, and we've kind of scaled it up to ensure that principals maybe can save a bit of time. Excuse me, and it's collected electronically now. So principals sign off on what's called Appendix 2, like, yes, I know what's going on in my school. I know we've done the right thing. We've got all the syllabuses sorted. We've done disability provisions, you name it, it's listed in Appendix 2. And so they have to be aware of what's going on in the classrooms. They've got to connect with each head teacher and that kind of thing. And then the director, the principal's boss, also endorses it. So the director, being responsible for a range of schools, endorses that and says, yes, I know what's going on in that school. Yes, we're all sorted, all clear, good to go. Yes, this HSC, all the syllabuses have been implemented, and that's fine, or effectively. The second part of that electronic collection is about HSC support data, teacher support data. So this is where if you are a new teacher or relatively inexperienced, maybe you're teaching the syllabus for the first time, or you might be a head teacher supervising people out of your own area of expertise, then the principal or delegated person, like the deputy, would input some data about what's going on. Nothing bad, just, who is it, what's the subject, and what forms of support are in place. So this is actually for greater system oversight, and that we're working on a big project where that data can be used to support people in schools, either in geographical areas and or in subject areas, depending on that need. So we can get a little heat map of what's going on where and direct some resources and support to the right places. So the structure of this HSC monitoring advice is broken up into 2 parts, and each year around November, it's emailed to all principals. It's published in, well, it was School Biz, but I'm assuming next time it'll be staff notice board, and it's also published on the Stage 6 webpage. So I'll go through each of these sections, probably spending a bit more time on section 1. And as I said, this is where the ROSA compliance information sits as well. But whatever goes on, we need to make sure school processes are time efficient, manage to support teachers, and whole school negotiated things. And you can see down the bottom, there's a little, like Appendix 1, there are excerpts of the Education Act, just what underpins the HSC as a credential. And Appendix 2, the monitoring confirmation, that's what the principals sign off on. So here's where it kind of gets a bit interesting. School, if I haven't brought you to tears already, schools have to do certain things to do with assessment. So we're going to unpack each of these. And the ACE rule, 8072, I have come to know and love. I've got intimate knowledge of this rule. But this is the one that requires, internal assessment, a program to be developed for each of the HSC courses, and for students to be provided with information about that in writing. But what we need to provide in writing, and this might be, hopefully this isn't new to any HSC teachers, but I'm sure you're all familiar with some of the processes. The number and nature of tasks needs to be in writing, the components and weightings, so those mandatory components in your assessment and reporting documents, and maximum weightings, say for trial exams and that kind of thing, has to be in writing. A schedule of assessment tasks with adequate notice, so the schedule being the assessment, that grid, the assessment schedule that students usually get given in an assessment, booklet at the beginning of Year 12. And then the adequate notice, that's generally the 2 weeks notice about when exactly each of those tasks will be. And of course, notices have to have certain things like, outcomes, type of task, nature of submission, timing or word limit, assessment rubric, like you'll be marked on how well you ... You don't need marking guidelines for every assessment task, because if you did that for an exam, then people would get the answers before the exam. It just depends. And any procedures, usually these are whole school negotiated procedures for marking. Maybe it's double marking, recording and reporting in terms of marks, reporting to parents, and or reporting to students, reporting back with clear feedback. So individualised, specific, and quite timely comments on their performance, and as well as the comments on how they've performed in relation to outcomes and their rank in that task. So this next slide is what I get the majority of calls about. There are quite a few, and I've got a couple of little anecdotes here. I get calls when schools haven't met such requirements, like these administrative requirements, and it's often not deliberate. I really think people generally trying to do the right thing. It's just that maybe their assessment policy doesn't have anything on invalid tasks, for example. So your school has to have, and this is specified in that ACE rule 8072, your school has to have information about what if a student is absent from a task, or what about if they're absent from the period before a task or the day before a task. Some schools have to go into that detail, but depending on their context. And I know some of the selective schools have to be really, really specific about that kind of thing, because the competition is unbelievable. So really quite clear procedures about absence from an assessment task or absence beforehand, late submission of assessment tasks. And in saying that, I've lectured at uni for the last 10 years, and I have to say, often schools' assessment, their late penalties are more harsh than like postgraduate uni penalties. So NESA doesn't specify a late submission of an internal task. They just say if there is no reasonable, if there's no valid reason for the lateness, the kid gets 0. But if there is a valid reason, they need to go through the school's procedures and things like that. Illness, misadventure, whatever the procedures the school has. In terms of illness, misadventure, I think this is particularly pertinent in a time like this. It's a time to be empathetic. It's a time to understand, but also be fair, and just follow the school's procedures, but with an ounce of with some humanity. I mean, I just even had a call today about students being required to a student that had suppression kind of disorder was being required to sit a trial exam on the 16th of August. And, any illness or misadventure kind of got denied. I think, oh no, well, what's happening? Anyway, the other thing I need to say about this is that even if a student applies, via the school for the disability provisions with NESA might deny it, but NESA's only denying it in relation to the HSC exams. So, and I even spoke to NESA today, the illness, misadventure or disability kind of provisions, your school can decide what is the fairest for that child, despite NESA saying no to having, supervision from home for an HSC exam. I'm hoping that makes sense, and I'm happy to take questions either now or at the end. Might do some more questions at the end, actually. So anything in relation to malpractice, like plagiarism, the penalties or consequences need to be made clear in the assessment policy. And that assessment policy needs to be explained and provided in writing to students at the beginning of the course. Any invalid or unreliable tasks. So if one teacher in a class has said one thing in terms of instructions or helped a little bit more in terms of interpretation, it has to be consistent across the board. But if one is declared unreliable or invalid, you really need to go back to your assessment policy. What do we do? And then go from there. Always seek advice as well. Anything to do with students' appeals and any indeterminations. I think that's probably a bit clearer in terms of what NESA requires. But the summary from this slide, I guess, is that the school needs really solid processes around each of those dot points. So what I recommend to people quite often is that if your school doesn't already have one, start an assessment appeals committee or an assessment committee or something like that as a mechanism for kind of independent decision making. Because the first thing that NESA will do if there's an appeal is come back to the school and say, did you follow your own processes? They go back to the assessment policy and say, oh, actually, we don't have anything on unreliable tasks. So then the appeal is upheld in favour of the student. So yes, I think that assessment kind of committee idea, I'm not into, making committees for the sake of it, but that committee idea just provides an avenue for some independent decision making, and then they provide notice in writing of the decisions to the students. But it's also about students knowing what to do and where to go if there's a problem and what process they're entitled to. So it's about fairness and transparency in a way. What schools should and must and should do to assist students. I mean, this is why we're all here. We need to assist students. So it's about lifelong learning and accurate and effective implementation of the syllabus. It's about being fair to the kids. So how can we as educators ensure equity and fairness for all students to achieve their personal best? So there's a couple of things. We need to fulfil NESA requirements. So they sign the Declaration of Confirmation of Entry. Usually that's done in a whole school assembly. We also need to ensure that students complete all my own work. That's before they start or submit any Year 11 assessment. And we need to provide information like HSC rules and procedures. This is part of what the principals sign off on in Appendix 2. We need to provide information about HSC minimum standard, any course information. A common practice is to, photocopy that page of the syllabus or link to it or whatever, draw student attention to that part of the syllabus that you're studying at that time and then move on. And timely advice about how to apply for disability provisions if that's the case. But our job is not just to provide it, it's to explain it well as well. So displaying information, either in online settings or physical settings, having that assessment information and assessment policy, approving patterns of study, like, if students would like an ATAR or just the HSC as it applies to them and their context, getting students to use Nesta Schools Online so they can check their own entries, they can check their results, HSC results and things like that. And more information is on page 4 of that HSC monitoring document. Now, to support staff, because this affects all of us, what schools must and should do to support staff. So this is about really engaging in having, and participating, negotiating systems that work for everybody in the school. So what systems can we use to ensure that scope and sequences, teaching and learning programs and activities are mapped to syllabus outcomes? Things like faculty planning days with evidence like at the end. Systems to oversee delivery of external courses like VET and the registered training organisations or students going to TAFE. Systems to ensure that students are enrolled in the right course in Schools Online or can opt to do optional exams like some of the VET subjects or, standard 1 maths and that kind of thing. And of course, systems to support students with a disability. So it's really, really important to have that whole school negotiated system, and that will come up again and again. But I think another thing is to ensure that there's a clear understanding of what goes on, a clear understanding from all staff of what's required for students with a disability. What do they do so they can participate fully and equally with their peers? But even, for example, if you are doing a trial, and a student has like an extra 10 minutes every hour or something, as can happen, it's about having clear communication. But so we're not interrupting that student. Oh, have you had your break yet? Or have you had, things like that during, say, their written exam, perhaps. Really clear understanding and consistent implementation of the school's own assessment policy and procedures. And, looking at the assessment and reporting documents for each subject. Assessment schedules and where records will be retained, but I will get to that as well because that's pretty important too. So that's on the next page, page 5 of the HSC monitoring advice. Now, in terms of best practice, this is all easier said than done, I know. In terms of best practice, I've just mentioned a couple of things. One had to do with communication. So effective communication between parents, carers, students and staff about different requirements, different expectations, the assessment policies and processes, any reasonable adjustments and that kind of thing. Differentiation, I think this is, obviously there's a big push for this as well because we need to support the learning needs of all students. And I really need to flag that for differentiation or setting an alternate assessment for a student, the outcomes and marking guidelines need to be the same, but the process and the product may be different. And I think that's really important when thinking about designing assessments because they're still being marked on outcomes and the guidelines, but how they get there is different, which is really good to know. In terms of implementation, yes, we've got to implement. Seems silly, but best practice is obviously to implement the accurate syllabus and the teaching and learning programs as documented. Monitoring, need to monitor students' progress towards the minimum standard. Monitor N warning determinations. N warnings. At a previous school I worked at, we had a week 5, like a midterm, you know, bang, what's happening? Bit of a stop and check in, right, who do we need to kind of focus on and help? How many N1s does this kid have? You know, and week 5 and at the end of every term, they were just good little checkpoints, and I still remember it. So that was quite a helpful practice, I think, we did in exec meetings. And monitoring the delivery of the HSC. So quite often deputies or principals will meet every term. It's common practice, and it's in this document that, head teachers have a meeting every term about what's going on. And I think it's about building that connection and getting support if you need it. Recording any adjustments or variations, marks and ranks, analysing data, analysing minimum standard data and HSC data. Consistency, although I did see an article in this, I don't know if it was Sydney Morning Herald. No, I don't think it was. It was about the band 6s. So don't get too hung up on data. Data is important, but, you know, it's all in context. Consistency across the school, maybe even think of kind of introducing, if you don't have it already, an assessment like template so kids know and realise, you know, when it's an assessment. That might sound a bit mundane, but it does help. Support from the senior exec, any high impact professional learning, developing a curriculum knowledge, of course, but also developing assessment knowledge. I think that's really important. Oh, sorry. And of course, the last one is collegiality, which is much harder said than done, because, you know, we work with a range of people with different personality types. This is how the world goes round. But, you know, if we can get that collegiality right, then so much more can fall into place. And more can be found on page 6 of the HSC monitoring document. Now, the next kind of big question, I guess, is what do we need to keep, like this section on maintenance of records. So you do need to keep a few things. This is for the department. Teaching and learning programs with scope and sequence documents and units of work. You need to keep assessments and all things related to assessment tasks, like notifications, the task itself, if they're different, you know, say if it's a class test or an oral or something like that. Marking guidelines, notifications of any changes. So this is particularly important right now if you've changed assessments from being face-to-face to online, or if they've been postponed, you need to keep evidence of those changes in writing and that students have acknowledged those. Any student work samples. So this one's often a bit contentious because NESA only require work samples for certain subjects like English, I can't remember the name, English studies maybe, and there's a maths one. They require 3 samples. But it's the department that require a few samples. The number is not specified. A lot of people keep, 3 per assessment task, like a high, medium and low. Or if you're particularly concerned about a submission or an issue or a student, then I'd probably keep theirs. And it's not too bad if it's electronic, but we don't want to go creating work for, you know, scan into PDF, you know, stand at the photocopier for ages. If it's electronic, it's easier to keep. But yeah, just keep that in mind because that's a school-based decision on how many work samples that you keep. Keep any adjustments made for students with the disability. All illness misadventure applications need to be kept, all student data, and records of students receiving assessment notices, course outlines, scope and sequences, etc., etc. And I'll go into the English language eligibility forms in a minute. It's very quiet. I feel like I'm talking to my own screen. Oh, you're all okay. Put something in the chat.
Listening intently.
So the next question I get asked is, how long do I need to keep it for? And there's a piece of legislation that says about 2 years. But if it's electronic, then it's easy to keep for longer. But whereas school like projects or a poster that a student hasn't collected, you keep it for about 4 months after marks have been finalised. So in terms of maintenance of these records, I'd love to hear, at an appropriate point, what your school does or what they use. But basically the idea is to keep it centrally or in faculties, but it has to be secure and backed up, whether that's in hard copy or electronically, up to the school. But if you've got it centrally, then everyone knows where you're up to. If you are affected by some unfortunate circumstances or you're off work for an extended period of time, as we've seen, during this kind of lockdown. So what the department is recommending now is that we want to move towards more efficient kind of practices that do save teacher time, or will eventually after setup. And if you can, move to electronic HSC monitoring. There's no, recommended software. There's no program or thing you need to upload your documents into. It is purely a school-based decision to avoid, photocopying, and photocopying something to put in a folder, in a lever arch folder. So there's a bit more about that on page 7 to 8 of the document, of the HSC monitoring document. And just quickly before we get to a couple of questions, is there are responsibilities kind of outlined. They're very general, but they can't be specific because different responsibility, it varies within schools. But some responsibilities are unpacked. But I guess the overall message is that take an active role in the process. So engage in and contribute to any discussions about HSC monitoring. If you're that HSC teacher, you need input into that, like what's efficient, what works, what do you need to keep, all that kind of thing. But whatever level in the school you're operating at, consult and engage. Make sure that you're supported and you support others. Communicate any concerns about students, the timing of tasks or delivery of tasks, and communicate those, and maintain accountability and of course your records. There's more on page 9 of that. This section 2, just quickly as well, it goes through a pattern of study kind of checklist with some requirements, like if students want to get an ATAR get their HSC, they must have 2 units of English, 6 units of board developed courses, and a minimum number of subjects, like 4 subjects. A maximum number of science units, 7 is the maximum. They must have completed all my own work before they submit any work in year 11 and 12, well, year 11, except some life skills courses. I'll talk about eligibility in a second. Any students with a disability need to be provided for, need to be supported. That was the one, English Studies, Maths Standard 1. The require 3 samples from NESA. Any exclusions, ATAR eligibility, making sure they're from category A type subjects. Any exclusions from, I don't know where I've put that, I'm sorry. I missed it, it's over here. Exclusions of course combinations. So this is particularly important for languages because you can't do things like Malay and Indonesian. That's specified, it's an ACE rule. You can't do, or you've got to do one of Croatian, Serbian or Macedonian. You can't do a combination of those. And yes, reasonable adjustments for students with a disability. And I think the most important thing, particularly during this time, just go back, is the well-being of students. So when you're planning your assessments, and this will happen, till in the next couple of weeks, I guess, for year 12, when your assessment schedules are due, it's really important to maybe plan across the board. You could even get I don't know if people do this already, but work with other faculties, exec work together, however it works in your school, but just plot on a calendar when those assessment tasks are due and think, oh, hey, there's a real bunch around weeks 7, 8, 9 of each term. Let's try and spread these out a bit. Because HSC assessments, they're always a pinch point. It's always like when, you know, student issues come to the fore. That's when you find out about what's going on, and we just want to make sure students are okay. Oh, this is what I was mentioning before. This is an ACE rule, see, 8008, and there are eligibility forms that must be completed and kept if students are doing certain courses. And it's about verifying, it's about fairness, basically. It's about verifying that, yeah, they are a beginner in that language. They don't speak it at home. They haven't come from, you know, Italy if they're studying Italian. Any continuers, you can see there the criteria, where a language in context and or a language and a literature course exists. So it's really important to support students if they're thinking about this, support students in, you know, I guess their subject choice, or even some of them might even need help filling it in. And those forms are available on the NESA website or next to that ACE rule from memory. Okay. Now that I've talked your ear off, I'm wondering if there are any questions. And feel free to use your mic. It does not bother me.
Hey, Kate.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Esther at Hurston Agricultural High School. I'm just wondering, with the eligibility form for the languages, how many years do we need to keep them at school?
Oh, so I'd probably go back to the, it's like a retention policy, a state, federal, I can't remember, but that'll be 2 years at least. But if it's electronic, if it's scanned, then it's not that much of a problem. It's more taking up, you know, paper space in a folder, I guess. But yeah, 2 years is the minimum after that student completes the HSC.
Okay.
That's to my knowledge, yeah.
All right, okay, thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Kate, this is Marcella. I have another question. It's with regards to differentiation. You were saying earlier that we can set an alternate task, but the outcomes and the guidelines need to be the same.
Yeah.
So in other words, how the student gets there can vary.
Yeah.
So we can actually modify the task. Now, who decides whether that student needs the task modified? Is that the teacher would have to decide that? Or do we need any, is there a formal procedure?
Oh, good question. So I think that some of that would come in to maybe disability provisions. They might need an alternate task. If there's been any evidence of malpractice, you can give them an alternative task. If there's been, what else? In what other circumstances? If there's malpractice, if one's been declared invalid or unreliable, or there's some issue with the marking or whatever, I do have to say though, if a task has been declared invalid, you're not allowed to discard, and the first task has been marked, you said a second one, you are not allowed to discard the marks of the first one. I don't know if that helps at all, but have I answered your question?
Yes. Yes,
I might have skirted around the side there.
Can I come in there a little bit?
Sure, yeah.
Well, as for differentiation, I think if a kid has an ILP, if they have an ILP, that's grounds for differentiation.
Absolutely.
For the invalid task and stuff, that's not, I wouldn't really class as differentiation. That would be an alternate task.
No, you're right. You're right. Yeah. You're right. Differentiation, would come into supporting students and adjusting. Absolutely. Sorry, my fault.
No, that's all right.
No, you're right. Setting an alternative task is not differentiation. Sorry, that's not what I meant to say.
Yeah, no, I realised
it's more, I would try and work out the issues with the original task before I set the second, because don't forget, you're stressing out a few kids. If you have to set a second task, alternative task for the whole cohort, that's very stressful and you're opening yourself up to appeal. But I wouldn't do that without seeking advice first from either NESA or the department.
I put a comment about your thing about discards, about giving them in school. Now, look, coming from having done disprofs as head teacher, learning support and things there, the only issue I have, and if you look at my thing, is that I'm very careful with the disprofs that I give in year 12, because in terms of getting them used to the disability provisions, like I said, if it's a reader and a writer or extra time, I don't really want to give them something NESA won't allow, which is why I encourage students from way ahead, you know, the ones who don't want to tell you there's something wrong and come in term 3 of year 11 and suddenly expect to get it. And NESA are getting really, really much fussier about giving us disprofs, especially if there's no teacher evidence. So it's about really asking or trying to encourage students to come through earlier and starting to give that in school, so you have the evidence. By the time they apply for it for NESA, you've got evidence that allows them to get that extra time, that reader, that writer, because those are not easy to actually use.
No,
you
need practice at that. Or students need practice at it, I guess. But I think my point with the special, kind of considerate disability provisions was that I think a lot of schools mimic what NESA will give students for the HSC with good intentions, because they don't want them to be disadvantaged for the HSC, but NESA are just making a decision, and I spoke to them about this today. They just make a decision for those exams. It's not for the remainder of the internal, all that prior assessment, like a year's worth. So I think it's about best supporting that student, and maybe some, if a writer has been denied for the actual HSC exam by NESA, then we need to put in place just, some support mechanisms so that student builds up and is able to write and do their best in the HSC. But if they need other support, or if they need a writer at some stage, then the school can do that. They don't have to go by what NESA says, because it's just for that exam. Am I making sense?
Yeah, no, I think in most schools, ours, the school-based assessments are separate from NESA, and we make it very clear to the parents that but because there are certain things that we can't do that NESA can.
That's right. Yeah.
And there's certain things NESA, can do that there's the thing. So it is school-based assessment as opposed to NESA. I suppose mine was just that in year 12, I do like them working towards what they might be getting, just to get them into that flow.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah. So you're coaching them to perform the best they can, in the HSC.
Kate, I hope this is an okay time to come in. My name's Jo, and I'm at a secondary college. I've had about, in my life of teaching, I've had about 7 or so different principals, and it's only with this more current principal that I have that this HSC monitoring has come about as being a really important thing. I don't know if that's because rules have changed or whether it's just that my previous 6 principals didn't know very much about it and so didn't care much about it. But really, I'm going through the first stages of understanding that HSC monitoring actually exists. The other day we had, because of COVID, we had online parent-teacher interviews.
Oh, yes.
And we went through those, and that was good. That was our first time to do that. And then it was a couple of days after that the deputy principal said, oh, by the way, you better put all your stuff into your HSC monitoring folders to do with the parent-teacher interviews. And so I scrambled all of my notes that I had together. They were really in bits and pieces here, there and everywhere that I had the notes that I wrote down for the interviews, and I put it in my HSC monitoring folder. So I just wanted to know if there is a comprehensive list of what exactly, I know you've gone through some of the points today, but are we basically putting every single thing that we do from the beginning of the day until the end of the day into our HSC monitoring folders? Or is there a list of what we are supposed to put into the folders and what we can not put into the folders? Because these days, more than teaching, what I'm actually doing is making sure I have everything to put into my HSC monitoring folder. And it's taking up a lot of time and a lot of energy. And I don't know if it's the principle that we've got at the moment or whether it's me not really knowing exactly what to put in there. But I had no idea that I should have been putting in notes about the parent-teacher interviews.
That's a good question, and I think that's a lot of work. Well done to you for getting it done. So I'm just looking at...
I didn't rewrite anything. It's just literally the notes I had, and I just...
Yeah, that's amazing.
Because I don't rewrite anything at the moment.
Yeah, the only thing that might relates to it is on page 8 of this document, which is on the website. You'll get a link to it. And it says what you need to kind of keep. And it says records of conferencing with students, parents or carers and head teachers or senior exec. But I don't think you necessarily need to keep records of every parent-teacher interview in there. I think common sense should prevail in terms of like, okay, well, if there's an issue and you needed to discuss it with the parent, then quickly whack something in, but that might go under a student profile anyway. You know, like there's do you use Central at all? I've just come from a school that uses
we do.
Central. It's quite handy, you know, just put in a quick note, parent phone call home, done. That doesn't take too long, but I think it's not very common practice to put in all your parent-teacher notes because you've got the report there. You've got the report. So you're having a conference on that student in relation to you've already
it was very standard. You know, there was nothing out of the ordinary. I understand that if you have something that's a little bit unusual and there's an issue with a student or a parent, I would definitely put that into Central. But just I think the standard notes.
Yeah, if there's an issue, yes, record it. Otherwise, everything's smooth sailing. It's about mitigating risk. This whole thing came about as mitigating risk and, you know, registering schools, making sure everyone's teaching the right thing, you know, the right English text, the right level language course, the right, you know, to the right kids. I actually haven't heard of that before and I'm sorry. But I think your report comments would already be in Central, would they not?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, there's your record. Done.
Yeah, okay. I think also the current principal is very into having hard copies as well, and a few staff have been thinking that we're doubling up a lot on hard copies as well as what's in the computer system. So
I think avoid that hard copying.
A bit of an issue as well.
Avoid the copying as much as you can. You know, if it's in the system, I don't think we need to reproduce it or print it. It just has to be backed up.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, take care. That's a lot of work.
Thank you.
I think you're all doing an amazing job, particularly during tricky times like this. There are a few minutes left. I just didn't know if you wanted to have a look at a scenario or not, or if there's any more questions.
I do.
Yes, great. If there's any more questions, you know, we've got a couple of minutes at the end. So here's just a couple of thoughts. Read the scenario, discuss any responses, and I'm happy for an open forum. It doesn't bother me at all. Go for it. Like to hear from you. A language teacher suspects that a student in year 12 has submitted work that is not their own. The submission was for a take-home assessment. The teacher is aware that one of the parents of the student speaks the language being assessed. Head teacher believes it constitutes malpractice, decides to set an alternative task. Now half the task is petitioning against the new task. These, you know, a couple of common things kind of put together, I guess. But, you know, what kind of issues with assessment have you had? If you want to contribute via the chat or via microphone, that's fine. What might need to be taken into consideration? So I've just got to move my screen. If setting an alternative task, and how would you prevent the scenario from happening again?
Okay, because we're short on time, we may just give people just a minute to think about that, and then we might move to the consideration slide.
Oh, sure. Yep. I'll just quickly close the door again. Sorry, Heidi came in before, a bit upset. I worded them up that I couldn't be interrupted for an hour. I turned on Moana. I did the right thing. I put snacks out on the table. All right. So I'm you know, told that this is a concern, I guess, among language teachers, that sometimes work isn't their own with you know, Google Translate or native speaking parents or whatever it might be. Yeah, it's a fair bit to make the class do, or if there's a couple of classes, make the whole cohort redo it. So these are not uncommon things. So some considerations. Can we prove it though? Exactly. So here are some thoughts. If you suspect malpractice, absolutely talk to your head teacher and contact Nessa. If you need, or you think you need to set an alternative task, you can't get rid of the original marks, but I would seek advice about that alternative task before even going down that path. The alternative task may just be for the one student that you believe did the wrong thing, or for the whole class, but it does seem strange, as Yasmin pointed out. It does seem a bit odd that you would kind of punish almost the whole class to do it again. But if, you know, talk to your assessment appeals committee and that kind of thing, seek advice. And there's that other point, you must assess the same outcomes and the same marking guidelines. But perhaps it's just a different stimulus, like a different, you know, oral component, or different like video with some short answer questions or whatever it might be. So to prevent that scenario from happening again, you might, I thought of another thing actually, you've got to check their eligibility forms. There's one. Remind them that they have completed, or should have completed, the HSC All My Own Work, which is about malpractice and plagiarism. Yes, Douglas, I agree. Always go back to the school policy and read it. What does your school say? Yes, talk to someone before you go outside. Yes, policy is your friend. I love this. Seek advice from your head teacher, and I would recommend even the head teacher calling Nessa or the department on setting that a different assessment. And also I think it comes into the skill of designing the tasks sometimes. So designing some original tasks that, or where it's more difficult to plagiarize information or consider different kind of components. I think some schools do like a validation type task. I know sometimes this happens in maths because if it's a take-home task, then they come and validate it, you know, say, is this actually your own at school? And Elizabeth has suggested that, yeah, this can happen in languages too. You take a part home and then you come back and, yeah, okay, well, you need to tell me or write or interview or do an oral or whatever it is in that language about those articles you collected, for example. Just reading your question, Margaret, the scenario could be possible, yes. I think, however, we need to think in broad terms, not just think about the task being done at home in languages, other subjects, yeah. Yes, they would have the same concern. Yes, math, yes, that's right. A couple of schools, NESA don't love it, the validation type task, because it's like assessing on the same outcomes twice in a way. But sometimes, you know, if that's what you got to do, that's what you got to do to validate it. But it comes in, yeah, I think really carefully about genuine design of the task, so information can't be plagiarized. That you can tell that. Yeah.
The example that we discussed with NESA, a similar situation, was if you have a take-home component, you link it to an in-class component. So an example could be that the take-home
I should preface that with they didn't love it for maths. Sorry, yes. I forgot. Yes, you've sought advice on
that. So the take-home component could be that the students need to create a portfolio of, say, 3 articles in the target language that they have read on any topic, healthy living, and then they do a short writing task on the 3 articles that they've chosen. Yeah. And then the in-class component, which is happening on the day that the take-home component is due in, could be a short conversation with you as the teacher regarding the 3 articles that they've chosen. So whilst that doesn't safeguard against Google Translate or parents, what it will do is it will shine a light on whether or not the student has completed the task independently, because if a student has done the writing task and chosen their own articles and all of those things, they're going to be much well placed to have that conversation with you regarding that. So just be, you know, the main thing is to seek advice and to read your school policy. We can't provide specific advice more than that because each school policy will be slightly different.
Yeah, sorry about that. You did say that my conversation with Nessa was only in relation to maths. I need to say that. Sorry, my apologies. So I think that brings us to the end. A couple of key messages are that whatever happens in your school in terms of HSC monitoring needs to be whole school negotiated processes. Consider student wellbeing in everything you do, particularly during this time. I think it's even more important. Try and move towards efficient practices like electronic HSC monitoring using whatever systems you've got available to you. Have really thorough assessment policy and procedures, and I'm happy to read through schools' assessment procedures. I've done it a bit and provided a bit of feedback and had meetings with various schools, and it's always good to, you know, get more eyes over things. So and the last thing is communicate effectively with, you know, whoever's in your school community. So schools, students, parents, staff. And please feel free to contact me if you would like any more information or a further conversation or anything. That's what I'm here for. And thank you to the language staff, language team for having me today. I'd like to thank my kids for staying quiet for mostly an hour.
I have a picture of her, by the way, Kate.
What's that?
I have a picture of her. A screenshot.
A picture?
A screenshot of Heidi.
Oh, do you? Oh.
Anyway, yes. Before I thank you, Kate, I just quickly wanted to mention a differentiation, because we sort of touched on it in our YouTube channel. We have a presentation by Marina Lang, the principal project officer diversity from NESA. It's called Making Adjustments for Students in Stage 6. Does everybody have to do the same thing? And if you haven't had a chance to have a look, we highly recommend it, because it will actually, it's a bit of a continuation to the differentiation conversation that we touched on today.
Okay. Oh, I'd love to see it.
It's excellent. So Kate, thank you very much for sharing your expertise and your knowledge with us. And before we finish, I would just like to share a couple of reminders when we have a very captive Stage 6 audience. If you're not already part of the of your statewide staff room in Teams, please join us there. Evia will just paste the link into the chat for me. Thank you, Evia. We have lots of resources for Stage 6 shared by you, the languages teachers of New South Wales. It's also a great place to share ideas and chat with your colleagues and with the Languages and Culture team. And our Stage 6 web section also has lots of resources organized by language, of course. You can find sample speaking questions for most courses, sample listening and reading activities for modern languages courses, and a sample Latin task for continuous, as well as advice documents for students on how to approach their HSC examination, particularly relevant now. These advice documents and more are also available on the HSC Hub. And finally, a week 7 meeting, as I alluded earlier, this term will also have a Stage 6 focus, looking at setting assessment tasks with our guest presenter, Adele Burke from NESA. And thank you very much. And we apologize for the 5 minutes overtime, but I'm sure that you'll agree with me when I say that it was well worth it. Thank you very much, Kate. And
that's okay.
I hopefully see everybody again in week 7.
Sorry,
you're more than
about
welcome
the
to join us,
start.
Kate.